Dear viewers, you are about to be immersed in a gripping tale of deception, danger, and political intrigue, narrated by Dr. Rami, exclusively for the Curious Case channel. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe. The Vanishing Chancellor was first published in a time of global uncertainty, when nations stood on the precipice of change, their fates hanging by a thread. The story reflects the anxieties of an era where power was as fragile as glass, and the hands that held it were never truly safe. Inspired by the deep-seated fears of espionage, sabotage, and unseen enemies lurking in the shadows, the narrative weaves a web so intricate that even the sharpest minds will find themselves entangled. It is a tale of how even the most secure fortresses can be breached, not by force but by cunning, and how the greatest threats often come not from the outside but from within. This story is a testament to the brilliance of Agatha Christie, whose mastery of suspense and deduction transformed simple crimes into puzzles of breathtaking complexity. With every turn of the page, the tension tightens and the stakes grow higher, leading to a climax so shocking that it leaves readers breathless. This is more than a story, it is an unraveling of power, deception, and the delicate balance between control and chaos. Now, settle in as we present to you Agatha Christie's The Vanishing Chancellor. I am with you, my friend. The matter is nearly resolved, just a trace remains. He is a stain, and like all stains, I remove him. With a flick of his cloth, he resumed his task, meticulous as ever. I watched him, amused, as I lit another cigarette. Anything interesting on your hands today? I inquired after a pause. A missing husband, he mused, dabbing at an invisible speck. A delicate affair, requiring the utmost finesse. You see, I have a suspicion, when he is found, he will not be pleased. What would you say? Perhaps he has taste, this man, to disappear so thoroughly. I chuckled, exhaling a slow ribbon of smoke. You sympathize with the runaway then? Ah, but of course, he replied smoothly, eyes glinting with amusement. Some prisons are built without walls, my friend. But alas, he held up his cloth triumphantly. The stain is gone, and now I am at your disposal. I leaned forward, lowering my voice slightly. I was asking your thoughts on the attack. The Chancellor, someone tried to assassinate him last night. He barely reacted, his fingers arranging his tools with meticulous precision. Ah, a crude attempt. A gun? A fool's method. Such things never work. They are relics of a bygone age. This one nearly did, I countered. The bullet missed by inches. He finally met my gaze, his expression unreadable. Inches, my friend, might as well be miles. If one truly wishes to eliminate a man of such importance, one does not fire blindly in the dark. One ensures he never sees the bullet coming at all. I reminded him, but he merely shook his head, impatient, as if brushing away a triviality. He was about to reply when there was a sharp rap at the door. The landlady's head appeared around the frame, her voice edged with curiosity. There are two gentlemen downstairs asking for you, sir. They won't give their names, but they say it's urgent. He barely paused, adjusting the precise fold of his trousers. Let them come up, he said simply. Minutes later, the door swung open, and I felt a jolt of recognition. Leading the way was none other than Lord Ashford, the formidable leader of the House of Commons. His companion, Mr. Bernard Doyle, a member of the War Cabinet, was a man of equal importance, a close confidant of the Chancellor himself. Mr. Leclerc. Lord Ashford's voice was low, measured, his eyes scanning the small, meticulous room. My friend gave a slight bow, his expression unreadable. Ashford's gaze flickered toward me, his lips pressing into a thin line. My business is confidential, you may speak freely, Leclerc interrupted, gesturing toward me without hesitation. He does not possess all my gifts, but his loyalty is beyond question. The hesitation lingered, thick and uneasy, but Doyle stepped forward, impatient. Enough of this, he muttered. We have no time for formalities. The Chancellor has vanished, gone, disappeared into thin air, and unless we find him, immediately England itself may fall with him. We arrived as soon as we could. Time is of the essence. Indeed it is, Leclerc said smoothly, gesturing toward the chairs with his usual precision. Please, gentlemen, be seated. Lord Ashford, might I suggest the larger chair? It suits a man of your stature. Ashford stiffened, his gaze narrowing slightly. "You know me?" Leclerc smiled, a flicker of amusement in his dark eyes. "But of course, I read the papers. How could I not recognize one of the most powerful men in England?" The slightest hesitation flickered across Ashford's face, but he nodded. "Very well, Leclerc, I have come to you on a matter of the utmost urgency. What I am about to tell you must remain strictly confidential." Leclerc inclined his head. "You have my word." "And the word of Leclerc is not given lightly." Ashford exhaled, as if steadying himself. "It concerns the Chancellor. We are in grave trouble. We're backed into a corner. That's the truth of it." Doyle interjected impatiently. "The Chancellor's injury is serious then?" I asked. "The bullet wound." Doyle let out a short mirthless laugh. That was nothing. A mere footnote in history. No, that attack was just the beginning." I felt a chill creep over me. "There has been another attempt on his life." Ashford's expression darkened. "Not exactly," he said gravely. "The Chancellor has vanished." I stared at him. "Vanished? Kidnapped?" Doyle said flatly. "Right from under our noses." "Impossible." I breathed, the very notion unthinkable. Leclerc turned to me, his expression unreadable, but in his eyes I saw something unsettling. Not surprise, not disbelief, something else, something far worse. The weight of the silence in the room was suffocating. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Leclerc's sharp eyes darted between the two men, reading the tension that thickened the air. "Impossible as it seems, I assure you, it is true," Lord Ashford continued, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Leclerc studied them for a long moment, then turned to Doyle. "A moment ago you said time was everything. What exactly did you mean by that?" The two men exchanged a glance, one filled with unspoken gravity, before Ashford exhaled sharply. "You have heard, Mr. Leclerc, of the upcoming Allied summit?" Leclerc gave a slow nod. "Naturally, for security reasons, no official details have been made public. The exact time and location remain classified, at least to the common man." Ashford's voice dropped lower. "But within diplomatic circles, the truth is well known. The summit is set to take place tomorrow evening, at midnight, in Versailles." I felt my pulse quicken. "Now, do you understand the magnitude of what we're dealing with?" Ashford's voice was barely above a whisper. "The Chancellor's presence at that summit is not just important, it is vital. The entire stability of the negotiations hinges on him." Doyle interjected, his frustration barely concealed. "The opposition has been relentless. Propaganda, misinformation, attempts to weaken his stance. The Germans have their hands in every dark corner, and without the Chancellor standing firm." He stopped himself, shaking his head. Leclerc leaned back, his fingers steepled in thought. "If he does not appear, then the summit collapses. The opposition wins. We are left in chaos." Ashford's gaze was piercing. "It is no accident that he vanished on the eve of this meeting. This is no mere abduction. This is a declaration of war in the shadows." A cold shiver ran through me. The Chancellor hadn't just been kidnapped, he had been removed, and unless we found him, before the clock struck midnight, history would be rewritten. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of what had just been said. The gravity of the situation pressed down on all of us, thick and suffocating. "If he does not appear at the summit, the consequences could be catastrophic," Lord Ashford continued, his voice tight with urgency. "A premature truce, one that plays directly into enemy hands. England cannot afford this gamble. No one else can take his place. He is the only one who can stand for us." Leclerc's expression darkened, his fingers tapping in measured rhythm against the arm of his chair. "Then you believe the Chancellor's abduction was a deliberate move to ensure he never reaches Versailles?" "Without a doubt," Doyle interjected. "He was already en route to France when he vanished. Whoever orchestrated this planned it with surgical precision." Leclerc reached into his waistcoat pocket and pulled out his watch. He flipped it open, glancing at the time with eerie calm. "It is now 10 minutes to 9. That gives us exactly 24 hours. 24, Doyle echoed grimly. "And a quarter," Leclerc corrected, his gaze sharp. "Do not underestimate the value of a quarter hour, my friend. It may yet prove the difference between success and failure." A charged silence filled the space before Leclerc leaned forward. "Now, tell me everything. Where and how did this abduction occur?" "In France," Ashford answered. "The Chancellor crossed the Channel this morning. His itinerary was simple. He was to spend the night as the guest of the commander-in-chief, then proceed to Paris tomorrow. He was transported across the Channel by a naval escort, and upon arrival in Boulogne, a car from General Headquarters was waiting for him. Doyle exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, and now, nothing. No trace, no witnesses, no word. He's vanished. Leclerc's eyes gleamed in the dim light, his mind already leaping ahead. A man of his status does not simply vanish. No, this is something far more elaborate. He paused, his voice lowering. The question is not just who took him, but how far are they willing to go to keep him? A chill ran through me. The Chancellor wasn't just missing, he was being erased, and we had less than 24 hours to bring him back. They had set out from Boulogne, a direct route, a well-guarded plan, and yet they never arrived. Leclerc's eyes narrowed. The car? Doyle exhaled sharply. It was a decoy. The real escort was found abandoned on a deserted road. Chauffeur and ADC both gagged and bound, unconscious. A muscle twitched in Leclerc's jaw, and the impostors, gone, vanished into thin air. Leclerc's fingers drummed against the polished desk. A convoy with a high-profile target cannot simply disappear, not under military lockdown. It should have been intercepted within the hour. Lord Ashford's expression was grim. That's what we thought. We've deployed the French police, Scotland Yard, and military intelligence. Every checkpoint has been alerted. Yet, nothing. A sharp knock at the door. A young officer entered, bearing a sealed envelope. Straight from France, sir. Ashford tore it open, scanning the telegram. His face paled. They found the second car. I leaned forward, pulse hammering, and Leclerc's voice was steel. The secretary Daniels, chloroformed, gagged, left bound in an abandoned farmhouse near Say. He remembers nothing, just the sensation of something being pressed against his mouth, and then darkness. Leclerc's gaze darkened, and the Chancellor. Ashford hesitated. No sign of him, no body, nothing. Leclerc's chair creaked as he leaned back, exhaling slowly. Then there's still hope. His gaze flickered. But why? Doyle frowned. What do you mean? Why go to the trouble of keeping him alive? This morning they tried to assassinate him. Now they're ensuring he stays breathing, but hidden. Leclerc's voice dropped, thick with meaning. Which means, gentlemen, we are not dealing with mere murderers. The silence was deafening. They don't just want him dead, Leclerc continued, his voice taut. They want him gone, erased. Unable to stand before the world at Versailles, Doyle's fists clenched, and they are prepared to go to any lengths to ensure it. The realization settled over us like ice. Time was slipping away, and somewhere in the shadows, the Chancellor was running out of it. If it is humanly possible, Leclerc said, his voice cold with resolve, the Chancellor will be at that conference. Doyle exhaled sharply. God grant, it's not too late. Leclerc's piercing gaze swept over the room. Now, gentlemen, I need everything. From the beginning. This shooting, tell me every detail. Lord Ashford nodded grimly. Last night, the Chancellor travelled to Windsor, accompanied by one of his secretaries, Captain Daniels. Leclerc's fingers drummed against the desk. The same Daniels who was abducted. The same, Ashford confirmed. They motored down for a private audience with the King. Early this morning, they returned to London. It was on that journey that the assassination attempt took place. Wait, Leclerc held up a hand. Who is Captain Daniels? His dossier? Ashford allowed himself the faintest of smiles. I anticipated that question. We know very little about him. No noble lineage. Served in the English army. An exceptionally skilled linguist. Fluent in 7 languages, if you can believe it. That's why the Chancellor handpicked him for France. Family? 2 aunts. A Mrs. Everard in Hampstead. A Miss Daniels near Ascot. Leclerc's head snapped up. Ascot? That's close to Windsor. We checked. It led nowhere. Leclerc studied Ashford's face for a moment, then asked softly, You trust him? A shadow flickered over Ashford's expression. Is Leclerc, in times like these, I hesitate before declaring anyone above suspicion. Leclerc's eyes gleamed with something unreadable. Prudent. Doyle, growing impatient, leaned forward. But listen, how in God's name did they pull this off? The Chancellor was under police protection. It should have been impossible to touch him. Ashford sighed. He was under heavy protection. His car was tailed by a second vehicle, plainclothes detectives, standard security protocol, and the Chancellor himself. He had no idea. Ashford's lips tightened. He is a fearless man. Had he known, he'd likely have dismissed them outright. But the police made their own arrangements. Leclerc's sharp mind worked fast. The chauffeur, hand-picked. CID man, O'Murphy. A pause. Leclerc's gaze darkened. An Irish name. Ashford hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he's from County. Leclerc waved it off. Doesn't matter. What does matter is how a heavily guarded, constantly moving target was ambushed in broad daylight. Doyle's jaw tightened. And how, despite an entire intelligence apparatus scouring the country, we're still standing here without a trace of him. The weight of his words settled over them like lead. The clock on the wall ticked on, time bleeding away, and somewhere out there, in the shadows, the Chancellor was running out of it. Claire, I believe perhaps 10 seconds. No more, but proceed, my lord. Lord Ashford exhaled, his voice tight with tension. The Chancellor's car set off for London, a closed vehicle. He sat inside with Captain Daniels. As always, the second car, carrying plainclothes detectives, followed at a calculated distance. Leclerc folded his arms, and yet, despite all precautions, they lost him. Ashford's lips pressed together. For reasons still unknown, the Chancellor's car deviated from the main road. Leclerc's eyes gleamed. At a curve. Ashford's head snapped up. Yes, but how did you? Leclerc waved him off. Continue. Ashford hesitated, then nodded. The police escort, unaware of the deviation, remained on the high road. A mistake, a fatal one. He took a breath. A short distance down that unfrequented lane, the Chancellor's car was ambushed. Doyle stiffened. An attack. A precisely coordinated one. A barricade, logs, crude but effective, forced the vehicle to halt. Then masked men emerged from the shadows. Leclerc's gaze sharpened, and the chauffeur, Ashford's tone lowered. O'Murphy. Leclerc nodded, as if filing the name away. Go on. For a fraction of a second, O'Murphy hesitated. Understandable, given the shock, but that delay cost them. The Prime Minister, instinctively reacting, leaned out of the window. Doyle sucked in a breath, and the shots were fired. Ashford's expression was grim. The first bullet grazed his cheek. The second went wide. Luck, nothing more. At that moment, O'Murphy understood the danger. Without hesitation, he slammed his foot on the accelerator. Leclerc's fingers tapped lightly against his arm, straight through them. Yes, he drove straight ahead, scattering the masked assailants. Ashford exhaled. It was a near escape. Doyle shook his head. Good God, they had him right there. Why weren't they more prepared? Leclerc's voice was quiet, but dangerous. They were. The attack wasn't meant to kill him, it was meant to stop him. Ashford hesitated. Perhaps. Regardless, the Chancellor was unharmed, save for a shallow wound. He dismissed it as nothing more than a scratch. Doyle frowned. And then, he stopped at a small cottage hospital, where his wound was cleaned and bandaged. His identity remained concealed, deliberately so. He insisted on moving forward, refusing to be delayed. Leclerc's expression didn't change, and the moment he reached London, Ashford's fingers tightened slightly on the desk. He continued as scheduled, straight to Charing Cross Station. A special train awaited him. Destination, Dover. Leclerc's voice was a whisper, and the police? They were informed only afterward, by Captain Daniels. A beat of silence. Then Leclerc leaned forward, his voice a razor's edge. And that was the last time anyone saw the Chancellor alive. The clock ticked onward, indifferent. Somewhere in the shadows, the answers were waiting, and so was the enemy. He departed for France at exactly 2 o'clock. The arrangements were seamless, or so it seemed. He boarded the waiting Royal Navy destroyer at Boulogne, vanishing into the misty grey of the Channel, and yet, somewhere along the line, the plan unraveled. The bogus car was waiting, identical in every respect, a mirror image of the official vehicle, down to the Union Jack fluttering from the hood. down to the precise diplomatic plates. Every detail was immaculate. Every precaution had been anticipated and countered. Poirot leaned back, fingers tented. That is everything. Lord Ashford hesitated. Yes, unless, he sailed. There is one rather peculiar thing. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Go on. Ashford glanced at Doyle before continuing. The Prime Minister's car, after delivering him to Charing Cross, did not return home. Doyle frowned. It disappeared? Not quite. The police, eager to debrief O'Murphy, immediately initiated a search. It didn't take long. The car was found. Poirot's voice was soft. Where? Ashford's jaw tightened. So, outside a certain establishment. Silence hung for a beat. A restaurant, Ashford continued, almost reluctantly, one with an unsavory reputation, known as a meeting place for German agents. Doyle muttered a curse under his breath. And the chauffeur? Gone. Poirot's fingers drummed lightly on the table. 2 disappearances then. The Prime Minister, lost in France, and O'Murphy, vanished in London. Lord Ashford's face was lined with tension. If anyone had told me yesterday that O'Murphy was a traitor, I'd have laughed in their face. And today? Ashford hesitated. Today? I don't know what to think. Poirot nodded solemnly, his mind already working, stitching the threads together. He checked his ancient watch, the ticking oddly loud in the room's hush. I understand that I have carte blanche, mon ami.
Absolutely.
Ashford confirmed. You will have complete freedom of movement. Poirot adjusted his cuffs and travel arrangements. A special train departs for Dover in an hour, Ashford said. A further contingent from Scotland Yard will be on board. You will be accompanied by a military officer and a CID man, both fully at your disposal. Poirot inclined his head. Excellent. He turned toward the door, then paused. One more question. The tension in the room thickened. Poirot's eyes gleamed as he asked, when exactly was the last time anyone saw O'Murphy? No one answered. And somewhere in the growing shadows of the city, the truth waited. Before you leave, monsieur, tell me what made you come to me. Poirot his arms, his sharp eyes studying Lord Ashford with unwavering focus. I am an unknown man, obscure in this vast city of yours. There are 100 men in London, more famous, more celebrated. Yet you sought me out. Why? Lord Ashford did not hesitate. We came to you upon the express recommendation and request of a great man, a man of your own country. Poirot stiffened. His expression, always carefully controlled, did not change, but a flicker of something dark and knowing passed through his gaze. Comment? He murmured. My old friend, the prefect. Lord Ashford shook his head. No, higher than the prefect, a man whose word was once law in Belgium, and shall be again. That is England's vow. For a moment Poirot said nothing. Then with a quiet, deliberate movement, his hand rose in a crisp, solemn salute. Amen to that, he said softly. The weight of history, of loyalty, pressed into the silence between them. And then, just as swiftly as it had settled, the moment passed. Poirot sailed, smoothing his impeccable sleeve. Ah, but my master does not forget, mon ami, he said with sudden energy. Hercule Poirot serve you faithfully. His expression darkened. But the question is, will it be in time? His fingers drummed lightly against his suitcase. His voice when he spoke again was low and troubled. This is dark, dark indeed, he muttered. I cannot see the shape of it, not yet. I, who had been listening in mounting impatience, could hold my tongue no longer. Well, Poirot, I burst out as the door closed behind the ministers. What do you think? Poirot was already moving, packing a small but precise suitcase with quick, deft movements, a spare shirt, a shaving kit, a neatly folded handkerchief, everything in meticulous order. I do not know what to think, he admitted at last. My little grey cells, they fail me. I stared. You? Admit defeat? Non, mon ami. Defeat? Never. But, he snapped the suitcase shut. My mind is troubled. Something does not fit. I frowned, trying to piece it together. If they wanted him dead, why not just, Poirot turned, raising a finger. You nearly said it, mon cher Hastings. Why kidnap him when a knock on the head would do just as well? Exactly, he nodded. Because uncertainty is a weapon, mon ami. It is sharper than a knife, more powerful than a bullet. I frowned, struggling to follow his meaning. Think, he said quietly. If the Prime Minister were dead, it would be a disaster, yes, but it would be a disaster that must be faced. The government would rally, the ministers would act, the world would move forward. His green eyes gleamed with intensity. But now, he gestured at the empty space before us, as though illustrating the void left behind. Now there is only paralysis. Will the Prime Minister reappear? Will he not? Is he dead? Is he alive? His voice dropped to a whisper. Nobody knows. I shivered. And until they do know, Poirot continued, they cannot act, they cannot plan. And what does that uncertainty breed, mon ami? I swallowed. Panic. Exactement, Poirot said grimly. That is what les Boches are playing for. Not murder, not martyrdom, but chaos. A shadow flickered across his face. And there is something else, he murmured. I leaned in. What? The timing. His voice was distant, thoughtful. Why now? Why at this moment? On the very eve of the conference? Why risk so much when the Prime Minister was already on his way? His gaze met mine, and for the first time since the conversation had begun, I saw something in Poirot's face that I had not seen before. Doubt. Unless, he murmured. He trailed off, shaking his head. Non, it is impossible. I felt my pulse quicken. Poirot, what is it? What are you thinking? But he did not answer me. Instead, with a final sharp click, he locked his suitcase shut, adjusted his tie, and strode toward the door. Come, Hastings, he said briskly. There is much to be done, and very, very little time. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked in the quiet, and somewhere, in the darkness of France and London, the trap was still unfolding. If the kidnappers are holding him somewhere in secret, they hold every advantage. Poirot's voice was quiet, measured, but there was a tension beneath it, like a wire pulled taut. They can name their price to both sides, he continued. The German government, mon ami, is not always generous, but in a case such as this, he gave a small sharp shrug. They will pay. Oh yes, they will pay. The question is, how much, and to whom? I felt a chill creep up my spine. Thirdly, Poirot added, eyes narrowing, kidnapping spares them the ultimate risk. A bullet, a blade, a noose. These are the instruments of murder, and murderers face the hangman's justice. But kidnappers, his lips curled, they deal in shadows, they leave no blood on their hands, they vanish into the night. A silence stretched between us. Then I said slowly, if kidnapping was their plan all along, why the attack? Why try to shoot him first? Poirot's sharp intake of breath told me I had struck a nerve. His hands clenched into small precise fists. Ah, he burst out. That is what baffles me. It is inexplicable. It is stupid. His frustration was palpable. He turned away, pacing in short, deliberate steps. Imagine mon cher Hastings, he said, voice tight with impatience. They prepare the perfect plan, the perfect abduction. Their arrangements are flawless. Ah, but then, what do? He whirled back to me, eyes flashing. They throw it all into jeopardy with a ridiculous theatrical ambush. He practically spat the words, masked men, masked, Hastings, as if this were a childish melodrama in some cheap cinema. He shook his head, muttering under his breath. 20 miles from London, he continued bitterly, where the risk is highest, where the streets are watched, where failure is inevitable, and yet they try to kill him. Why? The question hung in the air. I hesitated. Perhaps there were two separate attempts. Maybe they had nothing to do with each other. Poirot's expression hardened. Non, he said firmly. That would be too much of a coincidence. One could believe in a single conspiracy, yes, but two, operating independently, at the same moment, against the same target. His eyes gleamed. Impossible, I exhaled. Then, that means there must have been a traitor, someone who knew the plan and betrayed it. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. Yes, he murmured. A traitor, but who? I swallowed, my throat dry. It must have been either Daniels or O'Murphy. Poirot's gaze darkened. Exactement. But which one? I thought for a moment. It must have been O'Murphy, I said at last. After all, he was the one driving. He was the one who took that turn off the main road. Daniels was a passenger. He couldn't have ordered it without the Prime Minister hearing. Poirot steepled his fingers, nodding slowly. Was, that is logical. But then, mon ami, riddle me this. If O'Murphy was the traitor, why did he vanish? A man who succeeds in his treachery does not disappear without reward, and if Daniels was innocent, why was he so quick to explain? I felt the ground shifting beneath my thoughts. You mean? Poirot lifted a finger. There are, he said softly, too many whys, in this case. And worse, he leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. They contradict each other. A clock somewhere in the house chimed the hour. We both turned toward the sound. Tick, tick, tick. And in the silence that followed, I could not shake the feeling that wherever the Prime Minister was, time was already running out. If O'Murphy's an honest man, why did he leave the main road? But if he is a traitor, why did he restart the car? Why did he save the Prime Minister's life? Poirot's voice was smooth, but the weight of the paradox sat heavily in the air. And again, he continued, tapping a finger against his temple, if he were innocent, why did he immediately upon leaving Charing Cross, drive to a known meeting place of German spies? I exhaled slowly. It doesn't add up. It looks bad. Poirot, allô, he murmured. Let us employ our method. Strip away what we assume. Examine only what we know. He lifted a finger. First O'Murphy, against him, his decision to leave the main road, suspicious. His Irish origins, County Clare, that alone means nothing, but in certain circles, Poirot's lips pursed. It raises a shadow of doubt. Then there is the fact that he has disappeared, utterly, inexplicably, after the attack. Highly suggestive. Poirot's hand shifted. And yet, on the other side, his actions, his very instincts, saved the Prime Minister's life. If he were a traitor, why not let the attack succeed? Why risk everything to flee, to ram through the ambush? If he were part of the scheme, that is not the work of a man bent on betrayal. And then, of course, Poirot's gaze sharpened. He was a Scotland Yard man, and not just any man, mon cher Hastings. To have been placed in such a position means he was one thing above all else trusted. I frowned, feeling the pieces slip and shift in my mind, never quite locking into place. Then what about Daniels? I asked. Poirot turned slightly, his expression unreadable. Ah, Daniels, against him, not much, but what little there is, mon ami, is curious. Nothing is truly known of his background. That in itself is peculiar. He is a man of many tongues, too many perhaps for a simple Englishman. Poirot's voice dipped into something thoughtful. A man who speaks too well, too often, too fluidly, is rarely a man who tells the truth. I opened my mouth to argue but stopped. But for him, Poirot continued, nothing tangible, no betrayal we can point to, no single moment that damns him outright. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing as if seeing something invisible before him. And that, he said softly, is what troubles me most. I swallowed, waiting. Poirot spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. There is one traitor in this affair. One shadow among shadow, and yet, the facts, he broke off, frowning. The facts contradict themselves. A clock ticked in the distance. Tick, tick, tick. The sound filled the silence like a heartbeat, and I had the distinct uneasy feeling that somewhere, far away, the Prime Minister's time was running out. We have the fact that he was found gagged, bound, and chloroformed, I mused. That hardly suggests his involvement. Poirot, ever methodical, tapped a finger against his chin. He might have done it to himself, to divert suspicion. I stared at him. Surely not. Poirot shook his head. The French police would not be fooled by such theatrics, mon ami. Non. Besides, once his objective was complete, once the Prime Minister was taken, what possible reason would he have to remain behind? He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. If he were their accomplice, his best course would have been to disappear along with them. Instead, we find him, gagged, bound, and left behind, like discarded luggage. If his allies did this to him, what was their motive? I frowned. Maybe to make sure he wasn't suspected. Poirot's eyes darkened, or perhaps he outlived his usefulness. A chill passed through me. If he were truly an insider, Poirot continued, he could have planted a false lead, set the police on a wild chase, but instead, nothing, no deception, no trail. He merely says he remembers nothing after something was pressed to his nose and mouth. Poirot spread his hands. That, Mon cher Hastings, sounds remarkably like the truth. I checked my watch. We should get to the station. Maybe we'll find more clues in France. Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. Possibly, but I doubt it. Why? He exhaled sharply. It is inconceivable that the Prime Minister has not been found in such a limited area. The difficulty of hiding him must be immense. If both military and police of two nations have failed, his eyes flickered with something unreadable. How shall I? At Charing Cross, we were met by a sharp-eyed official, Detective Barnes of Scotland Yard, Major Norman. They'll be at your full disposal, the man said briskly. Good luck, Poirot. It's a bad business, but I've not given up hope. He strode away, his coat flapping behind him. On the platform we chatted with Major Norman. My gaze drifted to a small wiry man speaking to a tall, fair fellow, Inspector Japp, an old acquaintance of Poirot's, one of Scotland Yard's sharpest men. He caught sight of us, and came over, his face creasing into a grin. Poirot, knew you'd be on this mess, he said cheerfully. Smart bit of work so far. They've got away with the goods all right, but I can't believe that they'll keep him hidden for long. Our lads are tearing through France with a fine-tooth comb, so are the French. Poirot only smiled, one of those small enigmatic smiles that meant he knew something no one else did. And suddenly, as the train began to rumble forward, I had the unmistakable feeling that we weren't chasing a missing man. No, we were chasing ghosts. I can't shake the feeling that it's only a matter of hours now, the tall detective murmured grimly. That is, if he's still alive. Japp's face darkened. Yes, but somehow, I know he is, he muttered. Call it instinct. Poirot nodded, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against his knee. Yes, yes, he is alive. Then softer, as if speaking more to himself, he added, but can he be found in time? The train whistle shrieked, a long mournful sound. As the engine exhaled a cloud of steam, we stepped into the Pullman carriage. With a reluctant jerk, the train lurched forward, leaving the station behind like a fading dream. The journey was peculiar. Inside the dimly lit compartment, Scotland Yard men hunched over large maps of northern France, their fingers frantically tracing roads, villages, possible routes. Each had his own theory, some more plausible than others. The air buzzed with speculation, low murmurs, occasional bursts of disagreement. Poirot, however, was unusually silent. He sat rigid and still, his gaze distant, as if staring through the carriage walls into some hidden truth beyond our reach. His expression was that of a man trying to fit together pieces of a puzzle, only to find that some were missing. Outside, the scenery blurred past in shades of grey and green, a world unfolding yet offering no answers. At Dover, Poirot's behavior took an unexpected turn, one that, I must admit, amused me greatly. As we stepped onto the boat, he clutched my arm with surprising force. The wind, Hastings, he muttered, his voice trembling. It is a beast. I laughed, assuming his dramatics were part of some deeper thought. Courage, Poirot, you will find him. I am certain of it. Poirot groaned, shaking his head. Non, non, mon ami, you misunderstand. It is this villainous sea, the mal de mer. It is a horror. I blinked. Oh, the boat's engines rumbled to life, and Poirot visibly paled, his hands clenched, his eyes fluttered shut in agony. Major Norman has a detailed map of France, I suggested, trying to distract him. Perhaps. Leave me, he snapped, waving a hand. Do you not see? The stomach and the brain must be in harmony. He inhaled deeply, then turned his head left, then right, counting softly under his breath. I left him to his gymnastic suffering, and went up to the deck. By the time we docked in Boulogne, Poirot emerged immaculately composed, his mustache pristine, his suit impeccable, as if he had never suffered at all. Lagarde's method, he confided in a whisper, is a marvel. On the platform, Jap and the others continued their discussions, their eyes darting across sprawling maps. "Look," Jap muttered, his finger tracing the roads. "They started from Boulogne. Here's where they branched off. My theory, they transferred the Prime Minister to another car, somewhere along this point. See?" The tall detective shook his head. "I still say they smuggled him onto a ship. I'll check the ports." Poirot's eyes narrowed. Too obvious. His voice was calm, certain. I looked at him. "Then where is he?" Poirot simply smiled, a knowing, infuriating smile, and suddenly I realized something. He already knew. The order was given instantly. Seal all ports. No ship, no boat, not even a fishing vessel would be allowed to depart. As the first pale streaks of dawn stretched across the sky, we stepped onto the harbor. The cold sea air whipped against us. Major Norman approached Poirot, his expression urgent. "There's a military car, waiting for you, sir." Poirot nodded, but remained still. "Marie, mon ami, but for now, I do not intend to leave Boulogne." "What?" Norman blinked. "But we must." Poirot was already walking toward a small seaside hotel, his coat billowing behind him. Without explanation, he entered, demanded a private room, and shut the door behind us. Jap and I exchanged a glance. "What's this all about?" Norman asked, baffled. Poirot studied our faces, his sharp gaze flickering with amusement. "You expect the great detective to rush about, do you not?" His voice was teasing, laced with mockery. "To grovel on the ground, searching for footprints, to collect cigarette butts and matchsticks like a child playing at a treasure hunt." He let the silence stretch before leaning forward. "That is not detection." Jap folded his arms. "Then what is?" Poirot tapped his temple. "This." We stared at him. "All the clues I need are already here." He tapped his forehead again, his voice low and deliberate. "I could have solved this mystery without leaving London. The mind, mes amis, is the greatest detective of all. While you play hide and seek, I shall uncover the truth with logic and method." Silence fell over the room. Poirot settled into a chair, his fingers steepled, his green eyes flickering with an intensity that sent an unsettling chill down my spine. And then he did nothing. For 5 long, excruciating hours he remained utterly still. He barely blinked, his gaze fixed on nothing, like a statue lost in deep thought. Jap sighed loudly, shifting in his chair. Norman checked his watch for the 10th time. I, too, found my patience wearing thin. I stood, walking to the window, watching the daily steamship churn black smoke into the sky. My irritation grew. Was Poirot truly wasting time? If he was wrong, he would fail in the most ridiculous manner possible. Just as doubt crept deep into my mind, I heard his voice, calm, certain, unshakable. "Mes amis." Poirot was suddenly at my elbow, his eyes once clouded with thought, now blazed with certainty. "Let us go," he said softly, and I knew he had solved it. I turned. An extraordinary transformation had come over my friend. Poirot's eyes burned with an electric intensity, his chest rising with triumphant exhilaration. "My friends, I have been a fool," he declared, "but at last I see daylight." Major Norman snapped to attention. "I'll order the car." Poirot held up a hand. "There is no need." Norman hesitated. "Then how?" Poirot inhaled deeply, his gaze drifting toward the calm sea beyond the window. "Thank heaven the wind has fallen." His lips curled into a knowing smile. "We return to England." "England?" I gasped. "To work with method, mon ami. One must begin at the beginning." Poirot's voice dropped, deadly serious, and the beginning of this affair was not in France, it was in London. Hours later we stood once more on Charing Cross platform, the very place where our frantic pursuit had begun. Jap, Norman and I bombarded Poirot with questions and protests, but he refused to explain. "To start at the beginning is never a waste of time," he said simply. "It is the only way." During the crossing, Poirot had spoken to Norman in urgent whispers. As soon as we landed, telegrams were dispatched. Now, as we climbed into a waiting police car, a plainclothes officer handed Poirot a typewritten sheet of paper. Poirot glanced at it, nodded, and answered my questioning look. "A list of cottage hospitals west of London," he murmured. "I wired for it from Dover." The car roared through the city, weaving through traffic at breakneck speed. Hammersmith, Chiswick, Brentford. The names flashed by in a blur. I clenched my fists, realizing our direction. Ascot. A thrill of realization shot through me. Daniels. We weren't chasing O'Murphy. We were after Daniels. My heart pounded as we pulled up before a trim, respectable villa. Poirot leapt out and rang the bell, his expression sharp, expectant. Then a flicker of doubt crossed his face. Something was wrong. The door opened. Poirot stepped inside. Seconds passed. Too many seconds. Then he reappeared. His expression was dark, unreadable. With a short, decisive shake of his head, he climbed back into the car. Disappointment crashed over me. It was past 4. Even if he had proof against Daniels, what use was it if he couldn't uncover where in France the Prime Minister was hidden? We drove on, but now our course was erratic, zigzagging off the main roads, pulling up beside small, unassuming buildings, cottage hospitals. Poirot entered each one swiftly, reappearing within minutes. With each stop, his confidence grew, his posture became prouder, sharper, the Poirot of old, the man who could untangle any puzzle. Finally, at one particular stop, Poirot leaned in close to Norman and murmured something. Norman nodded. Yes, if you turn off to the left, you'll find them waiting by the bridge. We veered off onto a shadowed side road, and then I saw it, a second car, motionless in the failing light, waiting by the bridge. 2 men sat inside, plainclothes officers. Poirot approached them, speaking in low, urgent tones. Then, without hesitation, we sped northward, the second car following close behind. The chase was not over, it had only just begun. We drove for some time, the city lights gradually thinning as we headed towards the northern outskirts of London. The streets became quieter, darker, the houses more secluded. Finally, the car slowed in front of a tall, imposing house, set back from the road, hidden behind a line of twisting trees, a place designed for secrets. Norman and I were ordered to stay behind while Poirot and a detective approached the iron-wrought gate. A soft chime echoed as they rang the doorbell. A moment later the door creaked open, revealing a neatly dressed parlour-maid, her face a mixture of politeness and apprehension. The detective stepped forward. "I am a police officer, and I have a warrant to search this house." The girl's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a small scream, as a tall, poised woman in an elegant black dress emerged from the hallway behind her. Her sharp eyes flicked between them before her lips curled in disdain. "Shut the door, Edith," she commanded icily. "They are most certainly burglars." But before the door could swing shut, Poirot's polished leather shoe wedged itself firmly in the gap. At the same instant he raised his silver whistle and let out a shrill, piercing blast. From the shadows, a team of undercover officers sprang into action, rushing the house before anyone could react. The woman's expression flickered from arrogance to pure panic as the officers flooded inside, slamming the door behind them. Norman and Ahai sat in agonized suspense, forced to wait in the car as the raid unfolded beyond our reach. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The tension was suffocating. Finally, the door burst open. Out they came, 3 prisoners in handcuffs. The woman and one of the men were led to the second car, their faces pale but defiant. The third prisoner, however, was escorted towards our car, his movements slow, almost deliberate. Poirot stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "I must go with the others, mon ami," he told me, "but have great care of this man." I frowned. "Who is he?" Poirot smiled slightly, stepping aside to reveal the prisoner's face. My breath caught in my throat. It was Murphy. Oh, Murphy, the elusive mastermind, the man we had hunted across 2 countries, now sitting docilely beside me, his gaze distant and unreadable. He was not handcuffed, but there was a quiet finality to his posture. He knew the game was up. To my growing confusion, our route did not take us back towards London. Instead, we veered northward, deeper into the outskirts. The city lights faded behind us, replaced by long stretches of empty road, and then I saw it. A faint set of floodlights, glowing in the distance like phantom eyes. My pulse quickened as I recognized the landmark. Hendon Aerodrome. Poirot was planning to fly to France. It was a bold move, but also an impractical one. A telegram would be faster. This was no time for personal glory. We pulled up to the airstrip where a sleek military aircraft stood ready. Major Norman jumped out first, speaking hurriedly with a waiting officer. Poirot followed, his steps brisk but calculated. I leapt out after him, grabbing his arm. "You must wire to France, Poirot. There isn't time. You'll be too late if you go yourself." He turned to me, his expression unreadable. Then after a long, deliberate pause, he said softly, "Unfortunately, my friend, there are some things that cannot be sent by telegram." At that moment, Major Norman returned, accompanied by a young pilot in his flight uniform. The officer saluted. "This is Captain Leclerc. He'll fly you over to France. You can leave immediately." The pilot turned to Poirot. "Wrap up warmly, sir. It will be cold at altitude. I have a spare coat if you need it." Poirot glanced at his pocket watch, murmured something to himself, then looked up. "I thank you, monsieur," he said, stepping aside, "but I am not your passenger." A figure moved from the shadows. I turned, and my heart stopped. The man who stepped into the floodlight's glow was not Poirot, it was the second prisoner from the other car. As his face became fully illuminated, a jolt of shock ran through me. It was the Prime Minister. My mouth went dry. For a long moment, I simply stared. Then the realization crashed over me. The Prime Minister had never been taken to France. He had never left England. As we drove back to London, my mind raced. For heaven's sake, Poirot, tell me everything. How did they manage to smuggle him back to England? Poirot chuckled. "My dear friend, they did not smuggle him back." He leaned in, his voice a whisper, "because he was never taken out in the first place." I shook my head. "I don't understand." Poirot's smile widened. "The Prime Minister was kidnapped on his way from Windsor to London, not France. The real abduction happened before our very eyes." My mind reeled as he unraveled the deception. The chloroform attack, the perfect impersonation, the planted evidence, every move designed to mislead the authorities, to send them chasing shadows in France, while the real hostage was hidden in plain sight, and the man we all saw leave for France. I whispered, "A double mon ami, an impostor, disguised as the Prime Minister, playing the role to perfection." I exhaled sharply. The brilliance of the plan was terrifying. "But," Poirot added with a knowing twinkle, "they did not reckon with the brilliance of Hercule Poirot," and for once I could not argue. The next morning, the newspapers erupted with headlines of the Prime Minister's dramatic rescue. The kidnappers' syndicate was dismantled, and the real mastermind, Daniels, was exposed for orchestrating the entire deception. But one detail stood out above all. At the Allied conference, the true Prime Minister, standing before a cheering crowd, delivered a speech so powerful that it would echo across history, and it was all thanks to Hercule Poirot.